Good evening, everyone, and welcome to SocialFlight Live. I'm Jeff Simon. We have a wonderful show for you this evening. NASA astronaut and the first mother to fly in space, Anna Lee Fisher, is here this evening, and she has such a wonderful story. I cannot wait for you to all meet her. Now, before we get started, just a few things. First of all, SocialFlight's Fly to Win Challenge is just racing through to the next prize that we have coming up. We're giving away a Lightspeed Delta Zulu headset on February 1st. You still have time to win that amazing headset. All you need to do is go to get the SocialFlight mobile app for Apple and Android devices. It's completely free. Check in at your local airport and you're entered to win. And then if you continue to check in at other airports as you get out there and fly, then you get more points. You can be on our leaderboard and get additional entries into that drawing. We are here to support you and General Aviation and get people out there and flying, get to all the different events happening around the country, and also virtual events as we have tonight with SocialFlight Live. In addition, we have our partnership with the FAA and SocialFlight's FAA Learning Center that's available on socialflight.com and also on the mobile apps with all sorts of wings courses and aviation maintenance technician courses for that awards program. And if you're an A&P with an inspection authorization, you can get your 8 hours of education for free through us directly through socialflight.com. Just go to SocialFlight, check out the FAA credits tab in the menu, and then you can get credit. It all has to be done through the website there. Tonight's broadcast is brought to us by Continental Aerospace Technologies, been a strong supporter of SocialFlight for so many years. We are grateful to them. They also make the engine that's in our Bonanza that we fly behind, that great IO 550 engine. We got cylinders from them that are just absolutely bulletproof and doing fantastic. And also they, if you watch any of our videos from Sun and Fun or Oshkosh and AirVenture, things like that, then you've seen that we've also visited with their avgas, not just their avgas, but their Jet A engines for Tecnam and other aircraft. They just have so many great things, and they also offer an avgas and Jet A aviation technician advanced training program that's available on site, and I believe they may have some remote as well. Check it out with them. It's a great program where your mechanic, or if you're a mechanic yourself, can learn really about how to maintain these engines at a completely different level. So thanks to Continental so much for that. Now, on to tonight's guest. Dr. Anna Lee Fisher joined the ranks of NASA's astronauts in November 1984 on the Space Shuttle Discovery. As part of the famously diverse NASA Class 8, chronicled in Meredith Bagby's fascinating book, The New Guys, which I absolutely love. It's a fantastic book, The New Guys. Dr. Fisher became one of the first women and the first mother to fly in space. Her mission itself was pivotal. It marked the first time that NASA captured malfunctioning satellites from orbit and returned them back to Earth for repair. The mission had many challenges that required ingenuity from the crew as well as folks on the ground at Mission Control in order to achieve their goals. Following her flight on Discovery, Dr. Fisher served as chief of the Space Station branch from 1996 to 2002 and International Space Station Capsule Communicator, or CAPCOM, from 2011 to 2013. I am absolutely thrilled to have her with us here tonight. Please welcome to SocialFlight Live, Dr. Anna Lee Fisher.
I'm very happy to be here with you tonight, Jeff, and with your audience.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm thrilled. We both obviously are very familiar with the book, The New Guys, and this really tells a very wonderful story of each of the people that made up that group. And tell me a little bit about your background and what first drew you towards medicine, and then from medicine making the leap into being into NASA and into being an astronaut, which seems to be a fairly common path with that group.
Well, I wanted to be an astronaut since I was 12 years old when I listened to Alan Shepard as he was talking to Mission Control, and although it didn't seem like a very likely goal to have at that moment, that's what I wanted to do someday if I ever had the opportunity. But as I pursued my education, I was the first person in my family to go to college, and was very fortunate to get into UCLA. And as I was pursuing my career, my education in chemistry and then later in medicine, it didn't seem like it was going to be very likely that I was going to be an astronaut. So medicine seemed like a good path to follow. And I thought, well, if I don't get to be an astronaut, maybe someday I'll get to be a doctor on a space station someday. So I hadn't totally lost sight of the dream that I'd had since I was younger, but it certainly didn't seem likely when, all of a sudden I found out just by chance that NASA was looking for not only pilots, but mission specialists.
So now I'm interested. You went into emergency medicine, and to me, there's a bit of a story that must be in that because that seems to be a very a field for someone who's fairly driven. Yeah, I mean, medicine already is, but there's got to be some kind of connection between that and what it took to be an astronaut.
I was attracted to emergency medicine for many reasons. One, it's an exciting field to be in. You're dealing with people in all, from common colds to ear infections to gunshot wounds and freeway trauma. Um, it just appealed to the part of me that loves that excitement, but also helping people. And I will say that the training that I received in medicine was almost always more difficult than astronaut training because at least the astronauts, NASA believed they needed sleep to do a very demanding job. And certainly in medical training and when you're working in emergency rooms, the groups I worked with worked 24-hour shifts. And so in a way, it was like the best training possible to have to be an astronaut because everything else looked easier in comparison.
So tell me about your path. How did you come across when NASA opened things up and decided to make a change for Class 8, and how did they find you basically?
I was just towards the end of my internship at one of the UCLA affiliated hospitals, actually the hospital where they brought Tiger Woods when a few years ago when he was involved in the car accident. Great hospital for trauma. And so I was in the finishing the end of my internship year when one of my medical school friends, who was another space buff and received the NASA newsletters that he subscribed to, and in a conversation with my then fiance and later husband, who was about a year ahead of us in medical training, he had said, "Hey, you and Anna have always been interested in space. NASA is looking for not only pilots but mission specialists." And it was like a month before the deadline, just a purely chance conversation at lunch. And I still remember Bill paging me and saying, "We have 1 month," because we both loved space and I'd always wanted to be astronauts. I mean, we didn't even talk it over. It was just obvious that we would both apply. And back then, it took about a month to get everything together because you had to do everything with snail mail and transcripts, letters of recommendations. And I got my application in a day before the deadline, and then 6 weeks later was in Houston interviewing for the job I had always dreamed about. So it all came just kind of out of the blue, but I had no doubts that that was what I'd always wanted to do. So it didn't really require a lot of thought to decide to apply.
And did I understand correctly that that when you did you basically had to turn down your residency in surgery?
Yeah, at the, prior to that, I probably couple weeks before, I was considering where I was headed in medicine, and I loved emergency medicine, loved surgery, and had decided I wanted to go ahead and go into surgery. And I'd had a talk with the chairman of the department, and he said that, I mean, he looked me in the face and said women didn't belong in medicine because they wouldn't stay, particularly in surgery. And uh, but I was shocked when they actually accepted me in the program, and that was where I was headed when all of a sudden the NASA thing came along. So it was a incredibly difficult decision, something to give up. That was back in those days. It was incredibly hard for women to be accepted in medicine at all, much less to go into surgery. And so it was a very scary thing to turn it down for something that I didn't know even at that point that I was going to be accepted. I just felt like it wasn't right to take a spot away from a resident. And then there was a chance that I would leave. So Bill and I decided we would take that year to practice medicine, work emergency medicine, and then see what happened, and then regroup if we were not accepted. So it was a very scary decision to turn that down.
That's that's a big decision because you had nothing other than sending an application in at that time and no idea out of the thousands of people whether you were going to get selected. Tell me about the path and what it was like when you kind of got the news.
Well, it was, I mean, I felt like I was doing the right thing by not taking a spot away from somebody else and then potentially leaving. But the chair of the department was not really happy with that decision, which really surprised me, because I thought he would understand that. But so I'm really glad it worked out the way it did, because it could have been a very difficult decision about where I was going to go after that if I hadn't been accepted at NASA. So I'm glad things worked out the way they did.
Tell me about getting through the selection process and then what it was like kind of meeting the characters out there and going through that final process.
The process today is very similar to what we went through. There's a few little things added, but it's still a very similar process. You're invited there for a week-long interview process. I was in the second group that was interviewed for our class. It was the first class of mission specialists, and the first group of women that were interviewed ever. And it's really interesting because of the 6 women selected, 3 of us were in that first interview group. Ray and I were all selected, and then Judy and Kathy and Sally were kind of spread out among the later groups that were interviewed. But it's a week-long interview process. You get a lot of physical exams, interviews with psychiatrists, uh, lots of medical exams, and then the most important thing being the interview with the Astronaut Selection Committee, which is a committee of 10 to 12 people. It includes astronauts, the chief of the astronaut office, the director of, at that time it was flight operations directorate. It later became flight crew operations directorate. Now it's back to flight operations directorate, but and then it includes other astronauts and other people in management positions throughout the Johnson Space Center. And once you've made it through the medical tests and everything else, you really realize that that is the determining factor. And I had the chance to observe it both, as an interviewee, and then also I was on the selection board for the 87 class. So I had the opportunity to see it from both sides of the equation.
That makes sense. I mean, what they're obviously, tell me a little bit about some of the characters involved, because obviously that must have been a very exciting process with George Abbey, who kind of ran things. And when did you I guess, start to form that bond with what became your real classmates?
Well, with the classmates, that didn't happen until later, but in the interview process, you really do form bonds with there's always 20 people in every interview group. And so, we all had the same passion and dreams of going into space. Different people, had it at different times. Some people, um, didn't have that dream from when they were a child, others did. Some that never really occurred to them because the career of astronaut at the time we were selected was still a relatively new thing. And for the most, it was males and predominantly test pilots. So there really wasn't that much of a defined career pathway for people who were in a scientific field. So we formed that bond, but the real bonds in our class, I think, started to form when our selection was announced and we were brought to the space agency. And in fact, today or yesterday, I guess, was the anniversary of January 15th was when we were presented, introduced at the Johnson Space Center.
And how did you feel about being part of what even at the time was a pretty unique group? As you mentioned, it's very different from kind of the right stuff, test pilots, very straightforward group to I mean, tell me a little bit about the group and or some that you made closer friends with perhaps or anything.
I mean, I was just happy to be a part of it. I mean, it was just amazing. I came from a military background. My father was in the Army, and we grew up being all over the place. So coming into this organization that wasn't a military, but I would say a quasi-military organization, it felt very comfortable to me, and getting to be a part of this amazing. Well, I just, sometimes I just had to pinch myself. It was almost like surreal to find out that I was actually chosen to be in this group. To have something that you dreamed about and then had pretty much given up that was going to happen in your lifetime or at least your career lifetime, and then to suddenly have things change so quickly, from the time I applied in June 30th of 1977 to when the selection was announced 6 months later. That's a relatively short time to have your entire life change so dramatically. But I was just incredibly grateful because that was what I always knew I wanted to do.
There seem to be some things uh, that are part of your story that in astronaut training that were just perfect fits for you. In the book they talk about like getting in the personal rescue enclosure, which can be claustrophobic for people and really difficult for people. There's your specialty of working with the Canadarm, things like that. You seem to take very well to some of those specific tasks. What were your, what do you think?
Being in the personal rescue sphere, that was really good. That was part of our selection process, and we really weren't told a lot. And they just said, you're going to get inside this sphere and it's pressurized. The idea for these spheres was that they would be used if a shuttle was disabled and you had to transfer crew members from one shuttle to another shuttle, hypothetically. And so they didn't have enough spacesuits to put everybody into a spacesuit. So you would have two people in spacesuits and everybody else would be put in one of these spheres and transferred one shuttle to the next. So as part of the selection process, they just told us to get inside one of these spheres, and they really didn't tell us what was going to happen, how long you were going to be there. But you got inside this little pressurized, bigger than a basketball, big ball big enough to hold a person, but really not that big. And I had just come off of working several shifts in the emergency room, and I was exhausted. I just went to sleep. and and so, in talking with many of my friends that got selected, I think that was kind of what happened. Most people who got selected just got into the sphere and fell asleep, and then eventually, I don't even really remember how long I was in it. It just felt really good to get a chance to just get some rest after the busy weeks that I'd had prior to that. So that was something that I guess was a test that worked. Being coming from a background where you were sleep deprived was probably helpful.
That's, and yeah, I mean half the people are dealing with claustrophobia, and I guess the other half are looking at this as a vacation.
Yeah, like I said, I barely remember getting inside and going to sleep. That's it.
What about the arm? So when we're going to talk in a second about the mission itself, but learning that the space shuttle was known, of course, largely for its bay, what it could do, and all of that was orchestrated by this Canadarm. Tell me about the arm, what it was like to learn it. That's a very unique skill that not everyone was good at, and you seem to be pretty good at.
The actual, my actual first assignment that I worked on was actually spacesuits. They were trying to get a spacesuit small enough to fit someone my size. And then a later assignment, several of the women, Sally and Judy, worked on developing the techniques for the robotic arm, and then several of us also worked on verifying the software in the Shuttle Avionics Integration Lab, SAIL, which is where we verified all the software that's applied on the shuttle, including the robotic arm. So we had a chance to, all of us to really work, or several of us had a chance to work on the robotic arm in the development phase. So I was really excited when I was assigned to know that I was going to be to be able to operate the robotic arm and real, because all the things that we had done on the ground are in simulators and mock-ups and so forth, and so to know that I was going to actually get to operate the arm on orbit was really exciting.
Take me through the mission of you were delivering two satellites and you were bringing two satellites. You had satellites back, and that was obviously a first time.
Well, what was really funny about that being assigned to that flight was in February of 1984, the first flight of the manned maneuvering unit was taking place, Bruce McCandless, and I was sent to New York to be on the Today Show to provide commentary about the first flight of the manned maneuvering unit. It was also the same flight that deployed the two satellites that eventually were going to go rescue. And what happened was that the first satellite was deployed just before I left Houston, and it had a malfunction of the rocket that was supposed to take it from low Earth orbit, where the shuttle deployed it, up to geosynchronous orbit. And the rocket that was supposed to take it to the higher orbit failed a few seconds into what should have been a several-minute burn. And when I got to New York, I was talking to the taxi driver taking me to my hotel, and he said he thought that the same thing had just happened to the second satellite. I said, I don't think so. I don't think NASA would deploy a second satellite without understanding what happened to the first. But when I got to my hotel and called back to Houston, sure enough, the taxi driver was right. And so here were these two satellites that were in perfectly good condition, but were totally useless because they were in the wrong orbit. Communication satellite has to be in geosynchronous orbit so that it stays over the point on the Earth where they're providing communication for. So um, when I got on the Today Show, I was thinking, okay, now they're going to ask me questions about that. And I have no idea why NASA decided to deploy that. I know why they deployed the first one, but why they deployed the second one. And I remember saying to Brian Gumbel at the time, who was interviewing me, he asked, will NASA go get these satellites, try to retrieve these satellites? And I said, no way. You know, these satellites weren't designed to be retrieved. The robotic arm cannot just go grab anything. Whatever it's going to grab has to have a special grapple fixture that's designed to operate with the arm. So I remember saying, I I can't no, I don't think NASA will do that because they weren't designed to be retrieved. Best words I ever ate in my life. So a few months later, as we were assigned to our crew and things started to develop, it became apparent that if we were going to do the retrieval mission, and there were a lot of people who were not supportive because it was relatively early in the shuttle program at that point, and I think many people thought it was a risky mission, not so much risky in terms of a catastrophic risk, but risk of failure. And so it was really the insurance underwriters who were the big driver, Lloyd's of London and their subsidiaries, who were the big drivers for the retrieval mission. And I don't think the final paperwork that agreed, to launch this mission was signed until we flew in November. I don't think the paperwork was finally settled really till like September. So it was a really intense period because not only so the satellites were lost or put in the wrong orbit in February. Our flight was in November. That's a very short period of time to develop all the hardware, the training, the procedures, and everything. That's a very short period of time. And so it was so much fun. I don't think I'll ever have that much fun again in my life, being a part of something where everybody was working towards a common goal, both to save those two satellites, but more importantly, to demonstrate what the shuttle was capable of and what crews were capable of doing, that people had not really anticipated we could do. And I don't think I could have ever picked a better flight to be on with a better crew. Our commander, Rick Howe, was also eventually the commander of the return to flight mission after the Challenger accident. It was just one of the most exciting periods of my life, including all the work we did prior to the flight and then the actual flight itself.
Yeah, so tell me about that flight because that didn't go, perfectly to plan, even with all the challenges that you faced, and you guys had to figure a lot of things out along the way.
Well, we deployed two satellites. Those went flawlessly, and their engines that took them to higher orbit worked well. Um, and that was on days 2 and 3. And then day 4 was the day that we were getting really ready for the two difficult days 5 and 7, when we were going to try to rescue the Palapa and the West Star satellites. They're Hughes 376 satellites. And so um, the problem with the retrieval mission was, as I mentioned, the arm cannot grapple anything. So you have to figure out a way to get a grapple fixture on the satellite. And so actually, my crewmate Dale Gardner came up with the idea of how we could do that. And the idea was to get into their spacesuits, their EMUs, don the manned maneuvering unit, and then they had a device that would attach to the arms of the manned maneuvering unit, which we nicknamed the Stinger. It was a device that was going to dock with the nozzle end of the satellite, and on one side, the right side, I believe, it had a grapple fixture so that they could maneuver the satellite and get it in position, and then I could grab the satellite with the arm. And so that all worked flawlessly. Excuse me a second. That worked flawlessly. But then the issue was, if I can try to simplify this, you have the satellite that has this piece of hardware that has docked into the nozzle end of the satellite. Well, that is also the end of the satellite that has the structural elements that you need to berth it into the payload bay so that you can safely bring it back to Earth. So there had to be a way to release from where you were grappled, and we had to put another piece of hardware across the top of the satellite so I could release and then grab this top and hold it while they took that other piece of hardware out of the nozzle and then attached the hardware that would attach it securely into the payload bay. So the problem we encountered was that the piece of hardware that was supposed to go over the top of the satellite had an interference. There was a piece of metal interfered with how it attached. And because the satellites were already in orbit, we weren't able to do fit checks on the ground. And although all the Hughes 376 satellites are similar, there are differences. And somehow this piece of metal, when they were designing the piece of hardware to go over the top, was not realized in the drawings or something. I'm not sure where the problem arose, but the end result was that the piece of hardware that was supposed to fit on the top with a grapple fixture so I could hold it didn't fit. So at the time, we only had one TDRA satellite. And so we didn't have the continuous communication with mission control that we had on later flights after we had two TDRA satellites. So at the time this came up, we were out of communication with mission control. So we quickly talked over the situation among ourselves, and that was a problem that we had worried about. And so in our minds, we had a backup plan where we would hold the satellite manually by hand. But no one had ever held something as big as this satellite, as massive. And there really were no procedures or training or anything else to guide us. But we thought we could do that. And we had talked it over with our flight director prior to launching. But of course, it didn't seem like it was a likely possibility. It was kind of a remote possibility. But we talked it over. We realized that there was no way to make that piece of metal fit. And so we decided to switch to that backup plan. So when we came back in contact with the ground, we explained the situation quickly as we could, realized the clock is ticking. The guys are in their suit. They only had 6 to 6.5 hours or so. And so we talked to the ground, we explained the situation, and we said we wanted to do our backup plan, which not too many people in mission control other than the flight director and probably some of the EVA folks were aware of what we were thinking. It took them 5 minutes, approximately 5 minutes to say, okay, go ahead. And to this day, I'm always amazed when I think about that, because on later missions after Challenger and Columbia, they probably would have said, come on back inside and we'll figure this out. But no, they said, go ahead, our flight director, Milt Heflin. And sure enough, Joe was able to hold the satellite manually. We were able to go ahead and complete and then get the first satellite secure in the payload bay. In the day between those two EVAs, we had a long discussion with the ground with whether we should go back to the original plan that we had all trained for, or since we had just successfully demonstrated that we could do it this way, we finally decided to do it the way we had just demonstrated. So we did a slightly modified version, but basically the same thing on the second EVA. And then at the end of day 7, 2 satellites were in the payload bay, and I cannot tell you what an amazing feeling that was.
This is a really fun, cute picture of all of you, 2 up, 2 down, having successfully completed it. You remember the moment of doing this?
Oh, I remember the moment, like when they first came back after we finished the second spacewalk, EVA. It was the most, I mean, you could not have seen more excited, I mean, I think we almost couldn't believe it ourselves, it was, we definitely wished we'd had some champagne to celebrate at that moment, I'm sure. Um, it was really special. And then looking out in the payload bay, and seeing those 2 satellites there was, it was really one of the, if I have to list, the peak moments of my life, that was definitely one of them.
It's really so amazing. I mean, there are very few things that come back in whole pieces from space, right? I mean, moon rocks and the 2 satellites that you guys the 2
Yep.
satellites.
Well, and the other thing that people might not necessarily think about, because I know a lot of your audience are aviators, is because, the 2 satellites we were deployed were in the aft portion of the payload bay. And then we deployed them. And then we brought 2 satellites in, and the hardware to secure the 2 satellites was more in the forward portion of the payload bay. So we actually had the most forward CG of any of the shuttle missions to date. And I don't know, I've never looked at all the other flights, perhaps maybe the most forward that ever flew. And so that was also in its own right just a difference, because it was definitely a way forward CG compared to the earlier missions. So in that sense, it was also expanding the envelope of what the shuttle was capable of. In fact, we had to remove some of our lockers purposefully just to try to do everything we could to move the CG a little further aft. It was weird. We had like several lockers that were just missing, just to kind of help with that situation.
That's interesting. Who was the pilot that did the dead stick landing, the way that they land the shuttle on that mission?
Rick Howe, our commander, did the landing. Of course, Dave Walker was the pilot. He got to do some flying as we did the final approach. But the landing is always done by the commander. So Rick did the landing, and he did a superb job.
I'm going to bring up another a photo here that is really iconic. This is pretty classic. Tell me a little bit about this.
That photo was taken very cool, very close to the when I was first selected as an astronaut. The photographer is John Bryson, who was a life photographer, very well known. At the time, I was blissfully ignorant about all those sorts of things. The interview and the photos were agreed to by NASA, and it was they were putting together an article for all the 6 women that they were going to then put that article out when the first woman was selected to fly. And so it was actually done, I don't know, around 1980, I guess, something. When Sally was selected, they did or just prior to that, they did an article on the women, and that was the photograph. And there were different photographers who took pictures of the different, the 6 of us. And this picture, it was really, I still remember, he had everything all set up with his reflectors. And, at the time I didn't know a lot about photography or anything. And he had arranged to get the helmet, and he just had a vision of what he wanted in that photograph. And he just I mean, I think it took maybe a half hour, at most 45 minutes or something. And then he had me put on the helmet and told me to look here, look there. I I followed directions pretty easily and did what he told me to do. And then, then it was over and I forgot about it. And the article itself didn't come out for, a couple of years from when the photograph was taken. And then the article came out, and then as was the case back in those days, the publication, the Life magazine article, was printed. That was it. And so I, really forgot all about it. I actually became friends with John Bryson a little bit. He lived in Malibu, and just before I left to go to NASA, his house was in danger of being caught in these mudslides, a big storm they had in LA, and went over to try to help sandbag his house and everything. And so kind of followed him for a couple of years and then, got busy at NASA and living life. And then all of a sudden this thing called the internet came along, and somehow people discovered this picture like 1990s or early 2000s. And I remember I got a call from one of my friends who said her son wanted to tell me something. And I said, well, sure, have him give me a call. And he goes, Anna, guess what? You made the front page of Reddit. And I sort of went, what's Reddit? and what's the front page, front page in a sense, because it wasn't really a paper, it was internet. And so somehow that picture just suddenly developed a life of its own, separate, almost separate from me. And I remember I got a text from my younger daughter once, and she goes, Mom, guess what? You're on the poster for the concert for the Arctic Monkeys in Miami or something. And it just appears like just different places and stuff. And one of my sad things is that I think John Bryson passed away before he ever got to see the success of that photo that he took. And, it's really kind of weird to have a photo that's a photo of you, but it's almost like the photo has a life of its own that gets used by, I had a young high school girl who used that photo that she did a painting, and she won a artist contest. And I get friends saying, oh, they went into a restaurant and they take a picture and there's that picture on the wall there. It's really funny. But he's truly an amazing photographer who had a vision of what he wanted, and all I did was follow his directions.
It's very, very iconic. It's very, really symbolic and impressive. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So after you took some time off, you came back and really finished your career at NASA. Tell me a little bit about what the rest of your kind of life dedication through NASA was.
Well, I was assigned to my second flight shortly after I landed. We flew in November, and by December I was had been assigned to my second flight, and we were so close to flight. I think we were like 6 weeks from flight when the Challenger accident happened, and launched, a lot of decision making in that time frame, but finally decided that we wanted to have our second child. And then I found out that, two children is a lot more work than one. And also decided, I had never taken any time off with Kristen because I was assigned to my flight, literally before she was born, about 2 weeks before she was born. So wound up taking a leave of absence. Not intentionally, but it wound up being 7 years. And then when I came back in 1996, it was like probably one of the hardest things I've ever done. It was like coming back to a whole new place. Most of my classmates had left NASA, or the few that left had gone on into other positions with the NASA. And we weren't even in the same building. They had built a new extension, so it was a totally different building, totally new people. All of a sudden, you come back and they give you a computer. Before I left to go on my leave of absence, um, I left in '89, came back in '96. Nobody in the office, one person, Steve Hawley, the astronomer nerd in our group, had a computer. And when I came back, the first thing they did was issue you your computer. And I mean, back to business, we would have view graphs. When you were going to discuss issues, you would have meetings. Now there was email. When you gave talks, you had PowerPoint presentations. It was like coming back to a totally different world. But the one advantage of my still being there and having been the only person left in the office who remembered what it was like before the shuttle flew, as we were getting ready, to fly the shuttle for the first time. By the time I came back in '96, the training was very mature, the procedures were mature, everything about it was, not every flight went on time, but it was pretty on schedule. And so as we were getting ready to start building the space station, and now we were not only doing it ourselves, but we were doing it with our international partners, and in particular in the early days, the Russians. It was a totally new thing. And all the astronauts in the office at that time nobody knew what it was like at the beginning of the shuttle, which, it was not mature. The training wasn't mature. The procedures weren't mature. There was a lot of things we learned that we made recommendations back that made the program improve to where it was at that point. And so I felt sometimes like I was the lone voice talking to the chief of the office. That was Charlie Precourt at that time. People are being a little bit unrealistic in their expectations at the early days of a flight. Things are, and yeah, we're doing it with international partners, and the Russians, they really think they know a lot about space too, and so you can't just ignore their feelings and their positions on various issues. So I felt like I really was in the right place at the right time to provide leadership and to use the things I learned in the early days of the shuttle program. For example, this wasn't my idea in the early days of the shuttle. I don't know whose idea it was, but we created a group of astronauts, what we call the Cape Crusaders, that would basically go on Monday morning and spend all week at the Kennedy Space Center, basically embedding themselves with all the workers at the Cape, so that whenever an issue arose, they were part of the team and they learned about it from the ground up, not finding out later when it was presented at some high management meeting. And so I remembered that, and I thought, well, I think we need to create a group called the Russian Crusaders. At that point, the new astronaut class that were just getting their job assignments was the 1996 astronaut class, the Sardines, as they're known. And they were just getting their job assignments, and I picked a couple of them that I knew were really gung-ho hard workers and said, we're going to do the same thing we did with the shuttle in the early days. We're going to pick a group of folks, and we want you just to go to Russia. Just work with the engineers there, learn everything you can. When you hear that there's problems and stuff, bring all that stuff back and become part of the team, so that you're with, and it worked. And to Mike Fink, Dan Burbank, Peggy Whitson, Sandy Magnus, is that group of those guys that just did an outstanding job of becoming friends and partners with the Russians, so that we learned how to work together. And so in all I did was carry a concept I learned from the early shuttle days and apply it to this new situation, and it worked. And And so slowly, it wasn't necessarily pretty for the first expedition 1 and expedition 2, but we slowly learned, and we did everything. It may not have been always the best way, but it was safe, and everybody, and it worked. And years later, after I retired and I was doing some speaking in Moscow for the State Department, I had a reunion with a lot of the people that I had worked with and formed these bonds with, all that many years ago. So it was really neat because we all felt like, I think it was the beginning of how we began to feel like one team. And I think what's so important, like Sergei Krikalev was on the Expedition 1 crew. So I worked a great deal with him, as did many other folks in the program. And so now, when we're in this very difficult situation between the US government and Russia over the situation in Ukraine, and now Sergei has is head of the Russian Space Agency over there. And I think that's the reason why we're still able, despite all the politics going on, still Mission Control Houston, Mission Control Moscow are working together. We are launching cosmonauts with SpaceX, and we're sending US astronauts over to launch on the Soyuz. And I think it's because of all that hard work we did at the beginning, laying that the groundwork for our personal relationships. Because otherwise I would have no idea how this would, in light of the current political situation with the situation in Ukraine.
Wow, I never actually even thought about it from that perspective, the work that you did and how it translates to how things are today. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on where space, exploration is now, or tourism actually, since you see Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, SpaceX, in addition to regular NASA operations, are bringing more and more people into space.
I think it's great, and I think most astronauts think it's really great as well. Um, I think the more people that have the opportunity to see our planet from the vantage of space and realize how amazing it is, and then look out into the vast blackness of space, and perhaps humans one day will, I know we'll eventually make it to Mars, but when we will make it out of our solar system to some other, perhaps Earth-like planet, it's going to be a long time. So we need to really learn how to take care of our planet and take care of each other. And I think the more people that have the opportunity to see that view and to realize that we're all from planet Earth, and that although we have differences, cultural differences and so forth, religious differences, we are more alike than we are different. And the more people to have that experience, the better off we're going to be. And quite honestly, I personally, and I'm sure many of my friends, maybe not all, but are amazed at how quickly this transition has occurred. And I just had the opportunity to go to Saudi Arabia in October for the State Department and just see that the Axiom 2 crew had just returned, which had, I can never pronounce the Saudi's name very well, but to see the pride that they feel, and having their 2 Saudi astronauts, in addition to Sultan, who flew, on the shuttle way back in 1985, but to see the pride they felt about their female astronaut flying. And now I was in Turkey, and they have now, tomorrow, the Axiom 3 crew is launching with the first Turkish astronaut. And to see the pride all these countries feel to have their own astronaut is amazing. And when I go speak to other countries now, it used to be really hard to say, it's so great being an astronaut. Unfortunately, your country doesn't have a space program. Now I can say, yes, maybe not every country can afford to have a space program, but most countries would be able to raise enough money to send a crew on SpaceX or Virgin Galactic or Blue Origin, and at least have someone from their country go into space, and to see how much that means to other countries. I've had a chance to go to other countries with, an astronaut from them, and to see that the pride that is in Brazil, and just in all the different countries that have had like one astronaut go into space, and how much it means to them. I think it's really wonderful that we are now able to expand that, and I hope it's just going to be more and more and more, that the price will come down so that it'll be affordable to more people.
That's a wonderful way of looking at it. And I know there's still a distinction between some of those missions that are happening to ISS and that are, very trained crews and things like that. And then of course there's just kind of a space tourism. And for some people, there's kind of this, how do we distinguish what an astronaut is versus someone going up on a paid mission just as a tourist? What's your thought on that? How do we kind of diffuse that?
Well, my daughter, who's in broadcast journalism and was going to interview me, and she goes, "Mom, I'm going to ask you this question. What do you think about uh, uh, space tourists being called astronauts and stuff?" And I said, "Well, I don't have strong feelings about it, and some people do, some people don't. But to me, the term astronaut refers to someone for whom it's a career." And so what I finally said was, my distinction is, if you get paid to go into space, you're probably an astronaut. If you pay to go into space, you're something else, whatever you want to call it, explorer or whatever, But I don't really get too hung up over, nomenclature. But, there's a difference between if you're a career astronaut and the years of training it takes, to do that. And even on the Axiom cruise, Mike Lopez Algria and Peggy Wetson so far have been the commanders, that are former NASA astronauts that have both been commanders of space stations. So, those crews have somebody with them who is a former career astronaut. That, to me, that doesn't take anything away from people who are adventurers and want to go into space, and call yourself whatever you want to call. But the analogy I have is, I go ride in a police car with a policeman to see what they do. That doesn't make me a policeman. I haven't gone through the training that they have, and I certainly don't fill that function. And I think that's probably true of being an astronaut. But I'm not going to get hung up on it. Although I will say, I was in Belgium a few years ago, and I was there to speak, and one of the Virgin Galactic astronauts was there to speak. And in my talk, I just referred to him as a space tourist. I didn't even think anything of it. And he took offense at that. And I remember I said, "Well, but that's what you are." Nonetheless, like I said, it's really not worth arguing about. It's more like a, kind of a fun discussion. And there's always, in my mind, there's always going to be professional astronauts, and there's going to be more and more people that have the opportunity to go to space. And I'm happy, and I hope it eventually gets to where you don't have to have a lot of money to be able to go into space, because when it becomes something that's available to almost everyone, much like commercial air flight is today, I think the world will be a better place for that.
What a wonderful way of looking at it, and helps, especially if decision makers in the world and around the world can see our planet from that perspective.
Yeah.
Well, Anna, thank you.
Definitely.
Well, Anna, thank you so much for joining us tonight on Social Flight Live. Your story is very, very inspiring. Again, for anyone would like more information about it, the book, which is so wonderful, from Meredith Bagby, is The New Guys. Great book. And I just want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join us.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I highly recommend Meredith's book, because I actually learned a lot of things myself that I didn't know. So yeah, she really did a super job, and really enjoyed having the chance to be here. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Great. Have a wonderful evening.
You as well. Thanks.
And to all of you, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join us here on SocialFlight Live. We'll be back next Tuesday, January 23rd, with Michael Menzel of the James Webb Telescope, our last installment of space versus air back here on the Earth. And it's really fascinating, a lot of stuff that is worth learning about that amazing accomplishment of putting the James Webb Telescope into space, and what we've been getting back from it. And then we return back to the terrestrial world of aviation on Tuesday, January 30th, Flight Safety Detectives. Greg Faith is here, and we are going to talk. There's a lot going on when it comes to aviation accidents and investigation. You do not want to miss that episode of Flight Safety Detectives here on the show on Tuesday, January 30th. Then we take a week off, and we're back on Tuesday, February 13th, with Kurt Robinson, CEO of Robinson Helicopter, the most iconic aircraft helicopter manufacturer right now in terms of volume, at least. And they are just everywhere, and that the company is just soaring. So it's wonderful to hear from him. So I hope you'll join us for those shows. Until next time, I'm Jeff Simon for SocialFlight. Blue skies.